Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Thompson, and I am the Free Press Initiatives Program Manager here at the Freedom Forum. We are very happy that you guys are joining us today for our second iteration of our Do You Qualify as an Ally webinar series. And we have the great Francisco Vera Orta from IRE, who's going to be joining us as our instructor today. So I'll pass it off to Francisco. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Nicole. I appreciate some of you showing up today, and I know some people may be watching this later. And so time's the most important thing, I think, and I want to make sure it's worth your while. But I'm super excited to get to present this with y'all today, and please use the chat to offer your thoughts as we go along. We do pack in a lot in the hour, and so I'll have contact information available as well for follow-up questions. This is definitely like a session where we're trying to rethink what hard skills are. And so, it takes some time to kind of think about some of this. So that you're already here, you can start to answer this question with, yes, I want to be, yes, I hope to be, and yes, I hope I am. And there's always growth on allyism. I'm always constantly learning. So I'm really glad to see y'all here today and wanting to be on this journey, which a lot of us are all still on. So some basic introductions for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with our work at IRE on this or my background. I think what I always like to do is talk a little bit about cultural backgrounds. And so I leave that pretty open-ended. The way I use that is in my conversations is I grew up in like Military City, USA. And so there's a lot of diversity in some of our neighborhoods. And so some folks will lead with explaining their background with maybe their work experience or the places they've lived. It's not always necessarily the traditional identities that we talk about when it comes to race and gender. Others lead with that. So, but I think it's important that y'all know where I come from with my lens, and that I have certain perspectives that aren't in the mainstream, that aren't necessarily always centered, but also I have areas where I have gaps of knowledge. And I come to it with this lens through being raised here in San Antonio, Texas, a very predominantly working class Mexican American neighborhood. And my family's been here for a long time, over 100 years. And so a lot of times when I would be covering some of these issues, you hear all this rhetoric, and it kind of stick with me or grate on me hearing some of that, we're just here. And so another experience I've had that really opened my eyes was being a first generation college student. And so I speak with folks from all different racial backgrounds about that experience and just kind of like the culture shock you go through. And if you come from more of a working class background, being in the workplaces we are, it's a transition, and a lot of times we don't necessarily always know what to do. And if you're in a new multicultural space or one where you're a minority suddenly for one reason or another, you kind of go through growing pains there. So I went to Hispanic Serving Institution for undergrad, and then for my master's years later, I went to the University of Missouri, and I got a master's in data and investigative journalism. And so I, experienced marginalization, and I also was part of systems that marginalize others in spaces around me. And I always wanted to be an ally, but I think I didn't always know how to do it, and I failed at times, or I didn't have the vocabulary that we need to use. And so we're going to be talking about that, and you're going to be asking yourself some basic questions, and if you can answer any of these throughout the process, you're going to get better at this. Like within the hour, if you pay attention and you have an open mind, you will leave with a new skill. And that is what we all are about at IRE, that these are skills we need to do better reporting, retain the staff that we want after we've recruited them, even recruit them in the first place. The language you use, the tone you use, the approach you use is vital to building really happy, healthy relationships with your colleagues. And so this is informed out of 22 years of experience in the journalism space. And I've covered different beats, primarily education, but there's such a big intersection with healthcare, immigration, the business community, and retail follows the rooftops follow the retail, and a lot of times all of that's married into like what goes on in school districts. So I'm here to tell you that all of this is kind of blended into one effort that we're trying to do in the news industry. And it's part of this initiative today is part of the Power Shift project. And it was launched in 2018 in the wake of all the Me Too scandals in the media. I think there's been a lot we've learned through that. I think there's a lot we're still learning through that. And it focuses on involving diverse voices across the journalism, mass communication space, including journalism schools where a lot of us are turning to for recruitment. A lot of us go to later after we have worked in the industry a certain amount of time. So these skills will be applicable if you're like adjuncting or you're, doing some recruitment of students just out of school. Their expectations are very different than maybe me, who's an elder millennial, and my colleagues that are from other generations that preceded Gen Z. I get called out sometimes in my teaching when I'm on college campuses on things, and I prefer to say called in because it's an opportunity for me to learn. And so this project is really inclusive of trying to think of like, how could this be applicable to like any role you're in throughout the journalism production process, as we can say in kind of the capitalist structure, right? But it's essentially committed to this principle that harassment and discrimination are inseparable and intersectional. And intersectionality is a term that increasingly we're learning more about, and that you don't pick or choose a lot with our identities. And a lot of us feel like sometimes we're put in those positions. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And improving the culture of media organizations with training, because one thing I really do hang my hat on when it comes to our field is that we like to learn. And if we can step away from the hecticness of the job and sometimes the defensiveness that comes with how much we pride ourselves in knowing, you realize what you don't know. And that can really create wonderful breakthroughs. And I am a product of some of Jill Geisler's trainings over the years. I consider her in this space to be kind of a godmother to a lot of this fantastic training and culture shifting that's happened in the industry. And so she's based at the Loyola University of Chicago. She had taught this. She still does some teaching in consultation with Kathy Trost of the Freedom Forum, who's the Chief Engagement Officer and Senior Vice President. And so they come with really powerful perspectives with career experience and life experience that have helped shape this. So, you always want to define things. What do we mean by workplace integrity? And those are the goal of looking for environments free of harassment, discrimination, and incivility, filled with opportunity, especially those who have been traditionally denied it. And so we have to think a little bit about why were they traditionally denied it, who was denied it, and why. And it can start to raise uncomfortable questions and thoughts that we have to kind of deal with. So as we are on this journey together for this brief hour, just setting aside that, remember, what we've inherited is not our fault personally. And so to be an ally, you have to set that aside, that it's not about you. It's about trying to understand the dynamics of the space you're in and why they have been already predetermined to be shaped a certain way. And do you want to adhere to those? Do you want to challenge those? And if so, how? And so that's where allyism comes in, so critical, because it's about relationship building. And you have to think, okay, what can you do as an organization? What can you do individually? And then how do you do it the right way? And at least the way I teach this, the right way can be so subjective because it really depends kind of in the audiences you're with, the spaces you're in. Some communities really like directness. They want you to be candid. Others, you kind of have to ease into it. So there is not one way to do the right way. There's this fantastic handout. You'll be getting some resources that will summarize the slides today. So don't worry about taking a ton of notes. It's going to give us the backbone for today's session. This is really an opportunity for you to think about how you would handle some of these scenarios. What vocabulary are you not familiar with and you want to learn a little bit more about? And so these tips are extremely helpful. And as with all good trainings that the Freedom Forum does and that IRE tries to do, I was happy to get to partner with the Freedom Forum on this because I know it takes into account a lot of other perspectives that aren't necessarily having a seat at the table usually. And so all these organizations help shape this content, and it comes through the sessions that we teach, the conversations that we have, and amending it in real time to be like, oh, we left that out, or oh, this would be good to center in this. There's more of a request for this. But I'm a product of the Chips Quinn Scholar Program from the Freedom Forum, which early on helped me succeed and was a pipeline for a lot of newsrooms that were looking to diversify. And so for me, the Freedom Forum has this long relationship with these organizations, and I think that adds a little bit. So if you're shopping this out or trying to get other people to come do this, like it's not just built on Jill's perspective or Kathy's perspective or mine. It's built from all these years of experience. So it's key to remember that if you want to be an ally, you have to realize you're going to embrace the tenets of leadership. And you do not have to be in a management role to be a leader. It's can come down to the stories you advocate that you do, headline choice, what you decide to put prominently on your webpage or on your print edition or whatever, your Instagram account, whatever that looks like. And that becoming an ally isn't something you can kind of self-anoint, that it's something that others validate, that they tell you that they see that behavior from you consistently. Someone will tell you that. You'll see a lot of this right now with Pride Month. So, I came out at a time where there was a lot of bans for gay marriage going on in this country. And that's when I first learned the term allyism, and it's really become a lot more mainstream. And so in that, it's important to kind of know that it's something that communities a lot of times will bestow onto you as you do more and more work. But at its core, you're trying to be a trusted force for good. And building that trust comes from understanding the level of risk. Sometimes it will go in standing up for what's right. And you never know who is watching the watchdog, I say in some of our trainings. So people pay attention to that, and they look at that internally and externally. Like there are communities that are so used to us covering them a certain way. And if you're like, I feel like we kind of fall into tropes in how we cover this community. We're only down there for a crime. We're only cover this community when it comes to reproductive rights or pronouns. And there's so much more to these communities beyond that. And that's why these months are helpful, like to delve into allyism. A lot of times a good first step is like, oh, it's Hispanic Heritage Month, it's Black History Month, it's Pride Month. So let's do more stories. And it does put a little pressure on the systems to realize you need to meet those needs that our readers, our viewers, they want, and that it does feel like a moral responsibility in a multicultural democracy to get to these things. But where you see allyism really take root is in the times when there's not that pressure. And so sometimes you kind of have to go against the grain and being like, this is a little bit riskier to push for a story like this right now. Or, maybe it's not top of mind always, but others pay attention and they start to see that you're having confidence in taking those risks. And so no matter how far along you get on your journey, everyone that I talk to, that I learn from, that I feel are masters of this, that are role models, they tell me the work never stops. And I think if you're a list maker and you like to cross off that list like I do, it can be overwhelming, exhausting, like where do you even begin? And it's just really about starting somewhere. You can have the wherewithal, and like I do think in a lot of newsrooms there's like, we want to be this, but it's like we can't get to it all, so like maybe we don't get to any of it. Or like we did this for Pride Month, or we did this for Black History Month, so that's it. And you need to think beyond that. And so we're gonna break down that handout where there's like 10 major ways that you can help, and they aren't all of them, but it's, again, we are really big into data, so it's good to kind of know what are the environments we walk into. And so this lean in survey that was done, it was via SurveyMonkey, showed that more than 80% of white men and women see themselves as allies to people of color at work. And again, this is where intent versus outcome. And if there's one note you take, that is what trips up a lot of us in this journey, is intent versus outcome. You can have all the best intent in the world, but if the outcomes consistently aren't what that intent wants to go towards, then something's not working. And we focus on like, well, they didn't mean to offend, or I didn't mean to offend, or I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. Um, and you can get into people's minds and hearts, right? But you can see what are the outcomes of actions, be it public policy, be it an interaction in a newsroom. And so in our heads, we get this distorted view sometimes of how the intent is reaching, is manifesting through the outcome. And so we can say there's a racist act. We a lot of times we want to try to figure out like that person's a racist or that person's a misogynist, but it's like your behavior is, at the minimum, we can say that because that is the outcome of your behavior. That is the outcome of this policy. It's disproportionately affecting and victimizing this population. And so we get kind of caught up sometimes in our coverage and not thinking about the intent versus outcome. And I see it in this data where there's a lot of folks like, my intent is to be an ally. I feel like I'm an ally, but you ask the people most affected. And that's where you want to focus when it comes to outcomes in your coverage and really to your policies, even in the newsroom and how you treat people. Like, how is it affecting the people that this is actually supposed to be trying to help? And so allies feel this way, but the people that are on the other end that could benefit from that allyism say there's still a lot of gaps, and that they tend to see it from other people of color, maybe not from their, like if they're Latino, like they see it from another Black colleague, but they don't always see it necessarily from the white colleagues. And that can be stinging to hear. And you're wondering, like, what camp do you fall into? And again, that's something that you can't control their perception, but you can control the actions you're taking. And word gets around and people start to realize, okay, like this person means what they say. They're showing up every day consistently. So I don't know if any of you follow the Pew Research Center. They do, in the absence of a lot of good data about inclusion in coverage and inclusion in newsrooms, the Pew Research Center does great snapshot surveys of newsrooms and newsroom culture. And you can see here how people from different backgrounds feel like news coverage treats their groups. And so you can see some of the disparities here. And it's kind of telling, right? And so there's work to do in our newsroom to understand why there's tension. And so we pulled this out, and this is something that I really appreciated that Jill was highlighting and does in some of her talks, that so much of this came out of the Me Too movement and thinking about what if more people had spoken up in support of their colleagues. And so when it comes to how common it is for people to experience sexual harassment or assault at work and not reported, men and women do not always see eye to eye. Women are much more likely than men to say this is at least very common, while men are more likely than women to say it's somewhat common, or that it's not too or not at all common. And so you think about who is the most affected by these dynamics, and it's women. And so what are we as men doing to step up and use our privilege and our power to kind of keep an eye on this and to take what these experiences are from women colleagues to heart and take them seriously. It puts the onus on those that are already victimized. And I think that that's where you start to deconstruct a lot of the issues with allyism, and how we can be better about it. So again, you want to first kind of get a sense of what are the dynamics in your space, and these can be common outcomes that we saw in these surveys that can be happening in the spaces you're around or the spaces that you cover that are having issues about this. Like, where is the breakdown? Where is the pipeline breakdown? Where is the from intent to outcome breaking down as well? So half of non-LGBTQ workers say that they don't think there are LGBTQ workers in their workplace, while nearly half report being closeted at work. And there's a lot of visibility. Like, this goes in phases. Like, people think just visibility means like, oh, these people have power now. Not necessarily. There's tokenism. There is, I have a pass in the room as a queer person. I'm not going to act too flamboyant. I'm not going to raise my voice too much about certain issues. I don't want to get a reputation that I only care about this issue, when there's like, that's a huge part of me, but there's more to kind of what I want to do as a professional. And so there are still people that are closeted in our spaces. And sometimes the media industry thinks that we're one of the more queer friendly ones. And while there is more visibility, it doesn't always translate into like you can see us, but you can't necessarily hear us and you're not really listening to us. And so managers have to constantly do check-ins with their teams about this and figure out, what are the dynamics going on. And sometimes when you're so busy with, budgets and the state of the world, and, we just went through like a mass, traumatic event as a world, like sometimes your empathy well can run dry. I mean, there is a lot that's going on, but sometimes you have to remember that for those most affected, they're dealing with this day in and day out. Like right now, we're having conversations with two major journalism conferences for journalism organizations that are going to the state of Florida. And there's a lot of discussion about what will the safety be for folks there. And, a lot of folks enjoy going to another place and then like getting out and seeing the city. And there's lots of conversations about that right now. So you kind of have to always be doing check-ins about, oh, I don't have to worry about that necessarily, but your colleague might. And you may have a closeted colleague who is nervous about that. But if there's not a culture of check-ins and transparency and just saying it without targeting anyone, saying if anyone in this room ever feels uncomfortable, I want you to bring it up to us. I want you come to me privately, and that's when I felt like, oh, there's an offer there, and I can take it when that time comes if I feel uncomfortable about something. Don't put the onus on them to always come, because there are these dynamics there in these newsrooms. So recognizing the realities and risks of unconscious bias, it's always hard to know. There's like tests you can take, but you have to ultimately recognize that something makes you feel uncomfortable. That's okay. You don't want to stay there. That's not okay. You need to figure out why it makes you uncomfortable. And it could be that you had some trauma earlier in your life. It's a space that you're unsure about. You were raised a certain way. It's just part of the process. We all come with bias. And that is where, as professionals, we have faith that we can work through it and do good work. So we could do that in the newsroom and outside of the newsroom. And it's key to just see those differences. And they're, to me, I mean, I'm teaching from my lens, like, I think our differences make us beautiful. I think they can enrich so much of what we can learn from one another. And through understanding each other's differences, I constantly find breakthroughs with people about what we find in common, and that bonds us further. Like, oh yeah, we both grew up in this part of the country. Oh, we both grew up kind of in a household that was unstable. And we can be from completely different backgrounds with sexual orientation or race. But you realize that right now we're in a space of a lot of divisive rhetoric, and that spills over into our spaces through osmosis about resentment. And so you end up when you're not recognizing these biases, making some of these mistakes. You assume things, you believe that your experience is universal. And so while the gut feeling is somewhat informed through lived experience, confirmation bias is the X factor that can trip you up. And where you think something's going to go a certain way, but my gut's telling me this. I'm like, is it your gut or is it your bias that that side of town is like the poor side of town, and they're not gonna read the story, they're not gonna care about this story, so let's not cover it. Let's cover the higher income suburbs. Like, there's class differences there too. So there's all around us work to be done, and while that can feel overwhelming, you just got to start somewhere, and one thing leads to another. So for me, it's like when you walk into one of these overwhelming situations, I think about when you have like a room that seems disheveled and you're like overwhelmed. It's like you just start in one corner and you work around, and the work gets easier the more you do it. Like, it really does. Like, you start to kind of develop muscle memory about, oh, like, I'm sensing this tension in the newsroom or in the community. Like, here are all the nuances of maybe why that's happening. And so when it comes to like how we see these manifest in our newsrooms and operations, hiring, feedback, evaluations, negotiations, pay, promotions. I mean, look at all these spaces where if we do not recognize these differences and figure out how to address them, how to mitigate tensions that can arise out of them, they can sift into all of these places in our news operations. And ultimately, we want to do products that we feel are accurate, that are fair, that represent the communities, that tap into the markets. We want people to read our products, buy our products. We've got to keep the lights on. So you can make an argument for a lot of this to work kind of economically, or you can morally. And so how do you kind of get a sense of taking stock of that? And it's where you have to ask yourself, why do I feel that way when this comes up? Every time a trans issue comes up, I notice my initial reaction is like, oh, like, why do they keep bringing up pronouns? And like, you have to kind of examine that. Where is that coming from? You hear like, this is how certain people feel about things. And it's like, well, how do you know that? How can you confirm that? Um, it's the same process, and it's important to keep that communication going. Um, and at the stage of the allyship process, you have to remember what we don't know. And for me, that is something that I had to learn over time, to be a little more kind with myself, even though it can be very embarrassing making a mistake. I don't know what I don't know. But now that I know it, now as an ally, I got to do something about it. So that's where the work begins. Another tip on this tip sheet that you'll be getting is, remember that your earnestness in learning is great, but sometimes the groups that you're trying to get better in having relationships with can feel a bit encroached upon, and like having to share their knowledge or walk you through everything. There's lots of books. There's, Google, like people joke, like, let me Google that for you. There's so many great guides that like these journalism groups put out, like the Latino journalists, Black journalists, that you can go and read up on. Like the Trans Journalists Association has a fantastic guide and explains why this is the best word choice. This is the most accurate way. This is the most fair way of describing something. And you have to be cognizant that when you are asking to be educated, that you are somewhat putting the emotional labor on this other person. They may tell you that they're willing to do it. It's about consent. It's making sure like they have enough going on too. And so, when they leave the office, they have to worry about hate crimes in a way that we didn't a few years ago. And so there's a lot on our minds too. And so it's important to remember, like, that might be too much, but don't let that chill the effect. And it's about asking them like, hey, I want to get better at this. I've been reading on it. I've been doing some of my own homework, but if you ever have the time, and I'd love to talk to you about this or get your thoughts on it, because I want to get better at this. And most people will be like, yes, I welcome that. Like, why don't we have lunch on Friday, or we'll get coffee later today, and I can talk a little bit about what it's like to cover that community or what my experience has been. And so for those of us kind of on the receiving end, I wrote this column for Open News, and they do a lot of really great trainings and events that center on culture in newsrooms, and highly recommend them. And so when I'm in these interactions, sometimes I have to be the one that gets educated, and I have to ask, like, I want to learn more about this. What do you recommend? Is there something I should read, or do you, would it be okay if I pick your brain about it sometime when you're free and have a moment? And then on the other side of it, there's thoughts that go through our minds in these conversations. Are the white folks that I'm encountering at the starting line and scared to open themselves up to education, or worse, missteps and mistakes? Because think about this at our core, as those of us that provide quality information to communities. Our currency as professionals is being right, getting it right, not saying something wrong, not writing something wrong. I mean, we know about libel and slander, right? And the laws there. So sometimes I think we overcorrect, and it's like, you don't want to admit a mistake. And I have to tell that person, I'm willing to educate you on this, but you have to acknowledge that in the past that was a mistake, or that that's problematic, or that you need to stop that behavior. And if you're willing to go on that, then I'm willing to be vulnerable and like talk about my trauma with you about this, and share that knowledge. And there's folks that are like earnestly, like they have shown a consistency in allyship. And so they're just trying to level up, and they've come to a person from that community to do that. And a lot of times people will recognize that and be like, yeah, let me help you with that. So along the lines of emotional labor, there is invisible work, and we have the term here, underrepresented employees. some folks in the session say it's historically excluded. And I think that's really fascinating, right? Like when you look at systems of power and who's not represented, or maybe there's just one of us in there. So even that term is like on its journey, as I say, and how we use it in the space. But I want to focus on the invisible work part of it, because this is common. I see this a lot, particularly um, in conversations I've had in these sessions with women that feel, well, because we are known to have more emotional intelligence, or we're viewed as like having to kind of know people's emotions and read them and watch our own emotions because we're stereotyped as too emotional. Therefore, we do a lot of the relationship patchwork when there's tension in a space. And so I've read a lot about that. And so I thought, what are there ways to operationalize helping relieve some of that invisible work when you're in a position of privilege? And that can look different in any space. Position of privilege isn't race-based, it isn't gender-based, it is, you read the room already and you kind of know what the dynamics are there. So there's so many ways you can do this with joining these diversity task forces, helping diversify a committee, help with recruitment. If you are trying to look to take the burden off colleagues, you can do all of these aspects, like being a mentor, helping recruit folks into these spaces. Sometimes, like if you are knowledgeable about the same topic, you can offer to do the sensitivity read instead of someone else doing it who's normally always asked. So think about it like, okay, being asked, like we all have this to write the same amount of stories, but I'm being asked to translate the story into Spanish. I'm being asked to read this as a trans person and make sure that all the terminology is okay that we're using in the coverage. That is extra work, and that is work that's not always compensated. And so it's what we call the invisible work. And you'll hear in the interview process and in the process of like someone vetting a job from an underrepresented group, when they know they're going to be the only one, like how much of this am I going to have to do? So getting ahead of that, I think, is being a good ally. And that helps with making people want to stick around. So on here, you can scan this QR code. You will get links here. But you really want to try to find a way as a manager or in any position of power to figure out where the invisible work is happening in your space, and maybe how to eliminate that or alleviate that burden. And that's where those check-ins that we talked about earlier can give you those insights. Now, once you're in these spaces, I think everyone can experience microaggressions in different ways. I just had a colleague talk to me about experiencing some of them with ableist behavior. So I think with COVID, we talked more and more about long COVID and impacts of chronic health issues. And that's another area where I'm learning so much about this and how it can apply. Microaggressions, again, we get hung up on intent. So it's important to first recognize what they are. And so this is where you may not even be realizing you're doing things. Like ignoring someone, like you listen to certain people in the room, or you notice when a certain person of a certain demographic or certain years of experience, or whoever's like kind of regarded in the hierarchical kind of space, that they're listened to, but some of the others aren't. Recognizing that dynamic. And then avoiding it yourself, like interrupting. Some of us, like my partner has ADHD and told me that on his journey with treatment that he realized that he interrupted a lot of folks, and that sometimes people told him later, like, oh, he's a white passing Latino, biracial, half white. And so he's like, oh, some women told me like they felt it was kind of like women of color that I work with, like I was interrupting them, like I wasn't listening to them, or what I wanted to say went over it. And so he's had to kind of recognize that again, his intent wasn't to do that, but he had this other issue that he wasn't aware of. And once he got called in on it, then he started to see these patterns and make these connections. So if you're doing some of these things, sometimes it can be because you're rushed, or because there's something else at play here that you need to figure out why you're doing it, or maybe why your colleague's doing it, and then address it that way. So, but it can come across as like you don't care what I have to say. So you have to kind of learn, um, again, studying these dynamics constantly. And so you'll hear some of these words used like colorblind. It's like people of color don't have the choice of living in a world that's colorblind. So the intent there is again to say that you try to treat all people the same because you want to be fair. And there's this adherence to fairness and objectivity in our field of work that I think we are not realistic about how the world is actually shaped. So kind of being cognizant of those things and working with folks that maybe they use some of these and helping them along to be like, I know what you mean by this, but this is kind of where we're at now. And like, you have to acknowledge that these differences lead to different experiences out reporting in the field and out in the industry and just even out in the community. So you have to watch for all of these mistakes that you can make. You'll see like people like, I come from a Latin culture where people are touchy. And so, I've always tried to be cognizant of that. And, you have to make sure that you're always communicating what is people's comfort level. And this is not just, of course, internally, but also externally. What do you have a right to know? What do you not have a right to know about? So you'll see some of these again, like the list just grows as we do more and more of these classes. And you're like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. There's very intensive discussions about like word choice. Word choice can feel like a microaggression when you're writing a promo. It's like, well, this character fits in. It's like you can't use that term anymore. Like we have just moved on past it. And that's why those guides from journalist organizations, these are people that are in our field and say you should not be using that word anymore. So instead of it being all on you as the ally to say like, oh, they're coming in here and they're being all woke. And it's like, no, this is like the industry standard now. And we need to accept it or we look outdated. And it's going to be a distraction from the quality of our work. So that's one thing I really want to hit at because that is something that I think is more controllable for folks that aren't in position and power as a newsroom to advocate for and to build that. So in the chat, we're going to continue on because I need to keep us on a schedule. But if anyone's comfortable sharing, were there any microaggressions that you were surprised to see in there? Or are there any that you would add? Are there any that you want to share about your experience? Do not feel pressure to do that, but sometimes it can be really good to hear from each other, that we're all on this journey together. And so how can you, in the spirit of this challenge, qualify as an ally? And so it's again, we talked about challenging norms and taking risk. And when you see something that's not okay, calling it out. And there's all kinds of ways you can do that. Sometimes it's in the moment in front of people, but that itself can kind of create another weird dynamic. So there's been times where as we were leaving the meeting, I was like, hey, can we get, like, I'm gonna go get water. I'm gonna go get a coffee. Will you come with me? And then be like, do a quick check-in and then be like, hey, I noticed that, Glenda said something in the meeting and you just totally disregarded her. Like, where is that coming from? And it could be like, oh, here's the reasoning. It's like, oh, okay, well, I understand that, but I want you to know how it came off and how it could look. And like, I'm your, if you have that kind of relationship, you already probably have a degree of trust with that person. And that's where you can kind of move the needle. And if you're having those conversations regularly, you can shift the culture. And if people like-minded that are other allies of yours in that pursuit are doing it at the same time, it can shift the space. I have seen it happen. But you have to learn to deal with confrontation. And confrontation really sounds like an ugly word for a lot of us that maybe are shy or more introverted, but it's about accountability. And that's all you're just trying to do is make sure that you're doing your partisan with your privilege to make the space better for everyone. And that is also going to lead to better coverage, I assure you. So Emma Carey Grovum, who's now at the Marshall Project, does some trainings herself. She said, I asked, do you have a piece you could share? And so she had written this for Pointer. It'll be linked in your resources you'll get. But if you're a bystander, you notice something in a meeting, reach out to the person first. No one wants to be, white or insert your privilege here, savior Miranda. If it's your first time noticing a microaggression or you haven't spoken up as a bystander before, quote, back channeling is my number one tip. So you send your colleague a quick text and check in on them. Again, you're starting with the person who was affected the most. And so there's gonna be like, oh no, that's not a big deal, or like that's not how I interpreted it. And so like you're not trying to come in like too strong either and speak for someone. Again, it's an art. You learn more over time. It can be like, which one do I like? I meant well here to kind of like tell this person their behavior wasn't okay, but there may be an understanding between those two people in their relationship that you don't know, and that's just their dynamic. But it looks different to you because there's a race or gender dynamic from your eyes. So just checking in with, again, the people who are the most affected. So write that down if you are looking for a little notes, like checking in constantly with those who are most affected in your communities and coverage, and those in the newsroom that are underrepresented or have been historically excluded. That is where I've gained a lot of really great insight. So picking up from the courageous conversations, how do we define those? So vocabulary really helps us center what actions to take next. I think all of us were writers, we are communicators, a lot of us were English majors. So it's like having the vocabulary can kind of set the stage for the behavior that needs to come after. So courageous conversations are values-driven communication in the face of present or potential conflict. So what are some tips toward that? Be clear about your goal here. What are you trying to achieve? I want to make sure the environment is better for my Black colleagues or for the colleagues that are women in this space, because I know they've experienced historically a lot of microaggressions. And in your conversations with folks that you're holding to account, telling them, okay, this is like, I know you want to be a good manager. You don't, we work so hard to recruit people from different backgrounds. Do you want to keep them? And this incident happens. So like, what did you necessarily mean by that? And as they explain, okay, well, maybe this is kind of how it could come across, say what's wrong. And you kind of want to go, you want to be as clear and direct as writing out notes about what you're going to say in case you get nervous is helpful, because we'll slide back into sometimes like hyperbolic language can be triggering, can cause a shutdown, cause defensiveness. And so you're not attacking them as a person, you're focusing on the outcome of their behavior. And any of us that have gone to therapy, which I gladly volunteer that I have, it's really helped me covering a lot of traumatic stories in this industry. I think about what was the unhealthy outcomes of some of my behaviors, even though my intent was to be good to myself or to be good in a space. It's like, oh, I'm overcorrecting, I'm coming on a little too strong, or I'm being too passive. So again, it's not that, like, it's hard to know if someone is purely a good or bad person or is a racist or not. I just focus on their behavior. And we are all byproducts of what we have seen growing up and what we've seen over our time of lives and what people have gone away with and what's been said that's okay. And then something will change and it's not. And there's a struggle to accept that at a broad level in society. You can't control all that. You can control, I see this problematic behavior as a pattern in our space, and I think it's best if you stop it. And here is why. And that a lot of times will hopefully get them to kind of see the light. But it's like, when you go to an interview and you're going to hold someone accountable for a story, or you're going to have a meeting, or you're going to have that conversation with a loved one, you kind of prepare in the shower, you're thinking of your main points you need to get across. Where do you start? Like, some folks need to be eased into it. Like, how are you doing? Like, hey, I noticed this, this interaction, or I noticed this has happened a couple of times. What's going on here? And leaving it open-ended. And then other folks are like, you have that trust built a little bit, and you can say, hey, I didn't appreciate the tone you took in that meeting, and you were rude to like 3 of us, and of the 3 of us, like 2 were women of color. Like, do you realize how that came off? So preparation is really key, and I think having a successful, courageous conversation. And so, make sure that, behind the scenes too, like, it's good to check in with other folks that are doing this work as well and figure out where you can kind of build that general culture. And you lead by example. So if this person becomes suddenly an outlier in misogynistic behavior, it's going to become more and more apparent when the rest of the room doesn't stand for that, calls it out in coverage, calls it out in dynamics and conversations. And then, it doesn't always go great. And sometimes when you know it's getting to a place that it could be worrisome as a manager or as a colleague, document these incidents because not everyone's going to come around. So this we're going to use the chat for a little bit. We're going to do a quick case study here, thinking about how you would handle a situation like this. And you're invited to speak at a community event about professional ethics. You care about the topic in your community. You also care about diversity. The organizers that invited you didn't include information about who else will be on the panel. What could arise from this? What situation could you wind up in? Perhaps if you don't have a courageous conversation here. So please use the chat. I'll give you I'm just being honest with time, 30 seconds or so to think about it. I think always I joke when we do these exercises, I'm I can't see y'all or be in the room. It's like a room full of journalists and everyone's quiet. But this is a lot of information thrown at you within an hour. So let's be kind to ourselves about that. But I want you to start thinking in real world scenarios. What could happen here? And so as someone that's a conference planner, and on the other side, you think about, oh my God, what if I show up and I'm the only person and will I be tokenized if I'm from this background? Or it's a panel of all one demographic. And so it's then you're having to think about what the optics of that will be. And that's what gets a lot of people to think about allyism is just think of the optics, right? And that is an outcome. So Milena, yes, you don't know what other identities are represented and the panel may end up feeling one-sided. Virginia, I would ask for transparency on who has signed up for the panel and make sure it's racially diverse and gender diverse. That one, everyone is being promoted equally as well. Great points. That's exactly what I was thinking about too. So thank you for joining in on the chat there. Yeah, exactly. I've shown up and I was oh no, I'm representing all gay people now. I'm representing all Mexican people. So something to keep in mind. You're on a hiring committee. As your group reviews the top contenders, one of your colleagues says that last candidate referred to his husband. I have no issues about that, but do you think other people around here would be welcoming? So you're again kind of thrown into this. What would you do? So I think for the classes we've taught, they said why is that necessarily relevant? Is it us to assume what the behavior would be? So again, there are all these scenarios that come up and they're different issues here, right? There's all different ways to be cognizant of just in the moment addressing it. Not everything's a huge systemic overhaul. These scenarios pop up kind of every day in our jobs. And so there's always an opportunity. You can't always get it right either, right? But it's the more you start to acknowledge these, you're oh, you flag it faster. And here, in this example, this intern asking for advice, this longtime reporter, the questions start to get more and more personal. The intern wants it to stop, but is afraid the reporter will get angry. So you see different dynamics here. When it comes to in the hierarchy of power in a newsroom. Some newsrooms now are a little bit more flat, but I grew up of newspaper dynasty era, and so it'd be an intern could never go talk to the publisher, right? You wouldn't be in the same room even maybe. And so you think about the power dynamics here. So again, what would you do in these situations? And also, thank you, Matt. Yeah, that was exactly what I was thinking. Why is it necessarily relevant? So finding your voice for courageous conversations, I pulled this out and I said, as a person of color, I realized that my responses over time were usually determined by where I was at that stage of my life and career. Um, that I would think about what capital could I burn, what were the power dynamics at play, and what's fair and compassionate, because I'm trying to understand why that person's behaving that way to a degree. I think that's an inherent thing we ask when we cover people. So why wouldn't we apply it in our spaces? And so for me, earlier on, I was scared to say things because I was like, well, I don't want to get a reputation. I don't want to be this thorn in people's side. And so you have to remember that when you see other folks that are not speaking up for themselves, maybe those are the reasons why. And they're relying on you to help them along with that process. So our newsrooms are thinking of a lot of different ways in how to push back kind of operationally and using the psychology and the content we do. There's a focus on getting away from mugshots. We are talking a lot more about the role of addiction, the role of houselessness in how we cover crime, pushing back on disinformation in real time. If something's racist, call it racist. If it's sexist, call it sexist. If it's ableist, like in the moment, realizing that those in positions of power aren't necessarily always there for the right reasons. I think we know that. And so we tend to think, oh, it's from an official source. And we have this deferential attitude to it. And so it's something to keep in mind. Measuring what matters. This is a piece that you'll be linked to, but again, it's important to realize that we are still struggling to get an even sense of what our newsrooms look like. And why is there such disparity in a nation that is exceedingly more racially mixed, more racially diverse? And you look at systems like the K through 12 system, where the majority of superintendents are still men. That is a very political position of power, and that workforce is majority women. So there are systemic outcomes, and we can talk all about the intent of are we inherently racist as humans? Are we inherently patriarchal in our psychology, and how much of it is conditioning? But again, there's only so much you can do with that. You got to focus on the outcomes. So a lot of times it's a challenge for us to get a sense of where we're at. And so there's groups that are constantly taking stock of this. And so the National Association of Science Writers wrote here that, we believe it is impossible to identify and communicate the full range of stories about science without incorporating the perspective of storytellers, subjects, and sources that represent the breadth of human experience. So what they're doing here is they're putting out like a mission statement. And that's something to think about being a part of. And if you, for one reason or another, like these incidents, these situations aren't necessarily the place where you feel you can exercise your power, that diversity committee, or if you're in some type of operations side, like you have to have a degree of intentionality and state it publicly to hold yourself accountable, to be held accountable by others, and to set it as a goal that this is important to us, that we see the need for this. A lot of groups don't state it because they honestly are scared they're not going to meet it. And you can even see that in the diversity surveys that by 2025, we were supposed to have newsrooms that represented our communities, and we're nowhere near that. So it can be kind of scary for managers to want to commit to that. But you have to think, if you don't make that commitment, it's not going to get done. So some of you are very familiar with the power of mentorship, either in being a mentor or being a mentee at certain points in your career. And so the Freedom Forum and their curriculum, I love the way they broke this down, that a mentor gives advice. Mentorship requires time and attention. And so that's a great place to start. But a lot of folks want to go beyond that. And someone in these spaces that you're mentoring has a couple of other, what can feel like strikes against them in the way the system operates and how it doesn't really value their voice or understand them yet. So a sponsor advocates, and that requires coaching and a willingness to put your reputation on the line to help advance them. So it goes, beyond kind of just a little bit more of a transactional process that you're comfortable with, like a sponsorship of someone is like, I really want this person to succeed. I really believe in them. It borders kind of on feeling like an agent, right, for this person. But that sponsorship can really make someone feel like valued and protected, and then you'll get more out of that relationship, and it'll be more beneficial to the organization. So being more than an ally, there's the 5 A's here. You amplify, you amplify those in the room that maybe aren't getting amplification with great ideas. You're accomplice in how we figuring out how to overhaul some of these behaviors or patterns or systemic outcomes. You're advocating for folks that you really feel should be put in these positions and respected. And you're also keeping an eye out for other people doing the work inside your organization, outside of it. You know, you're swapping ideas. You know, they have been through this before, they're through it now. You build that network. And so one term I want to leave you with too is you'll hear in marginalized spaces about the whisper network. And word will get around that someone will say, oh, I care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they'll put it in their campaign materials, they'll put it in you know, on their website, they'll say it in an interview. But the more you do your homework and getting to assess other folks, you know, word gets around like, yes, they say that, yes, they donate to this cause, but they don't really support women in the office. Like I've seen them just kind of go with status quo. So that's where being an ally to the allies, I think, is key, because you have to kind of build that groundswell and you start to kind of network with each other about who are the folks that are truly putting you know, their name on the line, and you know, some investment into it beyond what's safe always for them, what's a no risk to them. And then being an active bystander, you know, kind of learning when do I step in and when do I not. And again, that is an art. So there are terminology here, like you can see amplifying like the voices that are out there that are trying to educate here, like a retweet. I mean, I know Twitter's kind of a mess right now, but kind of identifying these different angles. You're planning in a role that is welcomed. So this is where you can see some students that were Asian were being harassed, and so white students stepped up. Like this can be done at like any level. Like you're not like I'm standing side by side with them. I'm not just like saying I support them. Like I am actually showing up present physically in these spaces and being there. With advocating, this is a piece that I thought was really key right now when you're talking about trans coverage. It is for people of color, for those of us that our identities present very physically one way or another. Like you're constantly dealing in the back of your head with looking over your shoulder. And so in your office, you don't want to have to do that. And after a while, you get tired of that, because that is something you can control to a degree, and you will leave a space. I can't really control how I'm going to be treated at the mall or the grocery store if I'm holding my partner's hand, you know, but if I have a picture of him on the wall in a work meeting, I don't want to be dealing with microaggressions that I'm putting it in your face, especially if we say we're an inclusive workplace. And that starts to turn people off. So thinking about, you know, how you can support people that don't really, they can't mask a lot of their identity to pass. They're the ones that, again, the most affected by these outcomes. And knowing exactly when to intervene. So these are the 4 processes that Jill had written up about. You know, you sometimes need to redirect attention, you distract, and you document, because at a certain point, if it's a pattern, you may need to flag it to HR. So be someone who expects neither credit nor profit for my efforts to qualify as an ally. That is extremely key to this process. It pays off in ways that is so rewarding. Like you're already here, like 46 of you are still in this room with me an hour in, you know, on a lunch break almost. So just remember that it's about elevating others. You're a helper, but it's not about you, and therefore it's not all on you. You don't always have to be the hero. It's a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves. You just have to avoid that performative allyship. And so there's a lot of ways, and this will be linked in there too. There's a podcast you can listen to about that you can meet your allyship where you're at right now and then go from there. There's always going to be this work to do. So just to button up, because I know we're wrapping up here, there's I've been a product of this workplace integrity project. It's so fantastic. I highly recommend if you want to take this home, look up this project. You'll be getting more resources from the Freedom Forum. I've taken this and it's really helped me have more of these courageous conversations in my workplace when we do trainings. This next workshop is in September. And Tamara is, I've read Tamara be quoted about DEI in different publications like SBJ's Quill. So this will be a great workshop. And you'll get more information on how to register. Here's the link here. And wow, okay, I think 1 minute over, but I really appreciate it. I'm going to put in the chat my email. Let me make sure if we're good to go here. I really appreciate your time today, and I hope this has been super helpful. Nicole, any last parting words?
None. I think you did really well. Thank you. I just put in the chat the link to the Workplace Integrity Train the Trainers workshop. Again, that's going to be September 27th through the 28th. It is a 2-day workshop, and we encourage all of our news leaders and journalists and those who are working within the journalism field to join us for our next, and it is going to be our final workshop this year. So we would like for you to spread the word or sign up. But thank you guys for joining us, and we really appreciate your involvement and your participation in today's webinar.